And now the news, the stories. On that fateful day when Eden-based Adam finally realized that there was nothing else to do there but eat, sleep, and screw, life told him, all right, enough of that stuff. Now get on out of here and get to thinking. Regarding the question of hipness and style, the collective is always in fashion. They are, in fact, synonymous. The instinctive, the mental, and the matter of respiration. Aggression will take your breath away. In a certain solar system, there were sister planets, and on the first were all metaphors produced, while on the second were they subject to all manner of mangling and mishandling before they were allowed to immigrate. In an alternative time frame, a local creature once visited a speeded-up version of himself, a version of what we would call a mystic, and said to him, if you have something useful you could tell me, why don't you go ahead and say it outright and simply and stop all this playing around with words? No doubt about it, aggression will take your breath away. According to one legend, there was once a certain mystic school which, should you attend for a while then drop out, would grant you, instead of enlightenment, the ability to think endlessly in circles. One man challenged his mind to a contest of some sort. Guess who won? Okay, you can breathe now. When men grew weary and dissatisfied with speaking of nature, they began speaking of gods. And when they grew tired and uncertain with speaking of gods, they began speaking of philosophy. And when speaking of philosophy became hollow and self-serving, they began speaking of science. And when the subject of science seemed to be reaching a terminal edge, some men began to speak of psychology, while others returned to talking about nature. In the realms of even-numbered realities, many wondrous things are possible, both wondrous and pseudo-wondrous. Yeah. One man traded in his standard issue mind for a sponge, an asymmetrical sponge. Among the early post-Adam generations arose the belief that things were moving entirely too fast. Of course, that was a long time ago, right? There was once a man who decided to always think of clouds. No matter what else might be going through his mind, he would still, somewhere in the background, always be thinking of clouds. There was once a man who decided to always think of action. No matter what thinking might be going through his mind, he would still somehow manage to remember the word action. There was finally once a man who came to realize that what all such things are about and how they must overlap to be of any use. The king gave orders that all metaphors, either too loose or too rigid, were to be lined up and shot. Words are, to a more alert mind, its athletic ability. Two kids were playing around with their food, and one of them said, "Eat your ice cream real fast, and it'll make your head hurt." And the other, reflecting on the increasing neural activity he was experiencing, thought, with a noggin like this, who needs additional pain? The simpler the organism, the quicker it moves until you reach a certain level. Then occurs a kind of new order inversion. Fish sufficiently fleet, reptiles can become, and lizards quick enough may one day lions be. But man, oh singular mental man, he starts out simple, then as he grows, he slows and becomes more complex. But then as he ages still more, he returns to simplicity and grinds to a halt. Weep not for me, sing a few to the world. Though I've yet to reach speed, I forsook turning back. What greater protection can a mystic express? One man would stare at the sky. One man would stare at the wall. One man would stare at his feet. Another would stare at his TV. Yet they all stared at their mind. As he would lie in bed in the arms of his ever-active train, one man would marvel at it all, in between times of being abjectly disgusted with it. The difference between the placid, flaccid mass of humanity and the alert few is that one of the two can take it, and lying down at that. Make-believe warriors fight foe battles and dream of dreams that'll never be, while the dual knight of both mind and movement slays not his dragons, but sallies forth thereon. What man with anything resembling a functioning intelligence would lay siege to a city of glue? On one world, at times they were ready. On one world, at times when they were ready to send off their more enlightened to other worlds less so, they would prepare two launch sites side by side, whereat one spaceship with its nose pointed up would ignite and take off away from its home base, while the other, with nose down, would fire up and drive itself right into the ground. Two things come from instinct and the mind. Guess which one of them don't want to think about it? And now, some more news about twos. There are two types of men when it comes to metaphors concerning man: those who don't understand them and those who don't like them. Then this: on what will stand a one-legged stork? And have you ever considered the fact that were man still nothing but instinct, metaphors wouldn't be necessary? How to go about wasting the train travel you've experienced thus far. Begin talking to other passengers and thinking about it more than you actually do it. And one man thought, I like metaphysical efforts that are easy. From the factory of paradise came two atoms, an atom of action and one of reflection. And we're all descended from both. And now just some time for a postmodern query. Everyone has their body, but who possesses their mind? In one mystical school, you could specialize in either being enlightened or in talking and thinking about it. Need I bother telling you that one was more popular than the other? Those who preach to themselves, and one man uncovered the fact that popularity is a safety factor life uses with the collective. Proverb update: those whom life would drive mad at first makes concerned over the question of madness. Throughout mortal history, many a man has nearly gotten this one, only to be ultimately put off by its discomforting familiarity. Between the butcher, the baker, and the poker game dealer, it was concluded that you got to cut them thin to win, but you got to eat them fat to ever get your investment back. Yes, another episode in the God Will It Never Stop continuing story of consciousness and how it relates to thinking, at least when you're not thinking about it. A fully realized knight is subject to but one addiction. The heading of this story was to have been, Is No One Safe? Though why bother? Who amongst real warriors cares anyway? In the continuing matter of men and thinking, one guy got to thinking this. Men will pay to watch other men move, like in sports. They'll pay to watch other men engage in sex, as with pornography. They'll even pay to watch other men engage in thought, like in chess. So let's see. What won't they pay to watch other men do? Eat? Sleep? This is too weird to think about. And with that, he ended this chapter in this series. The instinctive vocabulary requires no modifiers, only the mental one, of what need is inflection to action. When the silence of life told Adam to leave, only the mind could have asked, how fast? During one of his pride-filled visits home, one night declared to his mother, in my business, we give no mercy, and we ask for none. And she responded, would you like some of that pudding you used to love so much? Some welcome traveler and combined safety news. Even a mystic can stay in one place too long, particularly if that place is himself and his own head. All men are divided into twos, except those who are not. So what the hell happened to them? When one wolf realized he couldn't take physical control of the pack, he began to verbally berate them and thus gained a personal following anywho. In another Eden lived an alternative Adam, whose life had trouble getting to think. So it took the short course and started telling him what a no-good, sorry son of a bitch he was. You can kick around thought, but not action. Think about it. One man didn't much like looking out into the universe. It reminded him of how much time he spent in the limited confines of his mind. I say that he didn't like it much, based on how seldom he did it. The larger the system, the more does its survival depend on moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action. Put alternatively, the collective is always mushy. Only the individual can be abruptly decisive. Above all established cities is the sound of gunfire heard, while in newly explored areas is the sky filled with silence. A certain knight was forever complaining about the unwieldy nature of his horse, till one of his companions asked if he was referring to his mount metaphorically, and the knight was suddenly struck afresh. Yes, he replied, that also. When his hormones began to weary, one man said, thank God. Definitely not a mystical kind of guy. The mind is wont to call instinct by any name, save its own. The mind enjoys reflecting on history in that it relieves it from instant action. Why else do men read and watch sports events? One man made a suicide pact with himself, to wit, that every time he'd say something that other people had unquestionably said before, he'd give himself at least a small, potentially fatal blow. You might care to know that his mind refused to participate in this scheme at all. Any physical artisan will say that a laborer is no better than his tools, yet where be the mental ones who likewise understand? Have you ever thought about the fact that even if animals had watches, they still couldn't tell what time it is? And did you further ponder why? The idea of mental time and space travel is moot in a land ruled solely by the twin regents of instinct and the mind. It does no good to yell, let me out of here, while not knowing the confining nature of me to begin with. So what could be more ridiculous than a rhino with a wristwatch, other than a mind with a plan? A plan that can only be acted on at some future date. The secret is discovered not through talking and debate, nor is it found through devotion or faith. So what the hell gives anyway? At routine level, the greater the thought, the smaller the mind. Normal running machinery tends to shrink the factory size. Then there was this other wolf who found he couldn't wrest physical control of the total pack, so he began howling in metaphor to some of them and soon developed his own small following nonetheless. In a land of quadrupeds, a man who knows the secret of quintuple shoe construction had best have a fallback occupation. The collective loved the repudiation, physician, heal thyself, and not for the reason understood. Were it not for self-pity, few would have pity, and most no self. And not to be from the festivities excluded, one ruddy-cheeked, silly-faced chap named Gustavo exclaimed, well, slap me silly and call me Gustavo, which about wraps it up again. One man's mind declared, I'm ascending if you're receiving. And once he realized where it was coming from, the man mused, are you kidding? Men continue to enjoy the adage, never send a boy to do a man's job because they know there ain't no man a-coming. Hey, if you think that's funny, whether you get a good gander at the boy filling in. We won't go into that, will we? History remembers great men, and men remember history. See, it saves them from wasting a lot of unnecessary time on things like action and like that. Since instinct has no time, I'll give you this. If you're mentally concerned over tomorrow, tomorrow will do you no good. Oh, I know you think it will, but that's just a trick of the mind. There are two types of people attracted to the mystical way, those who want to be depressed by the idea and those who don't. Need I spend time here knowing to you that one of these groups is larger than the other one? One man now claims to have come from a world where they simply cannot stand the idea of things coming in twos. There are two potentially chivalrous formations, a metaphorical knight on a real horse and a real one astride a metaphor. Gazing upon the unwashed, unattractive partner with whom he was about to have sex, a man mused, hormones will make you do almost anything. Then added, but so will your mind. Tell the editor to hold that one. If the mystical quest is not an actual external search for a physical grail, but the whole thing is an internal adventure, then why can't it be more described in those terms? Well, there's your answer. Yeah. The collective, the individual, and the search for personal fulfillment. Sheep who comfortably within the flock live are bothered not by questions regarding the connection between weakness and happiness. The truest of knights is he, riding out front alone, on his visor, the slightest of smiles. When it comes to travel advisories regarding those of an extraordinary nature, life issues none. Thanks for the help, said one man. No, I mean it, he said. In their travels did two knights become lost and fall into the hands of an evil magician, who pronounced his decision to execute them, but to grant them a final wish. And the first one said, since you are a creature of wondrous powers, before you kill me, let us see, shown on the side of yon mountain, a full replaying of my life. All that I did, all that I thought, all of my triumphs, and all of my tragedies. And when he signaled for the other knight's final wish, he said, kill me first. I wanted to pick up a bit about what we were talking about last time, having to do with the fact that the norm never finds anything humorous about itself. The norm also equating with majority, but in any particular area, both external and of the only possible significance to an intelligent person, internally, metaphorically, but that the norm, / the majority, never finds anything humorous about itself, nor can it, or does it, engage in any useful amount of introspection. By so doing, there is a kind of necessary protection, self-protection, that life experiences through man. And it was further reflected in one tonight, a news item that said, the larger the system, the more does its survival depend on moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action. This is simply, or is, an expansion of that same idea. And if you look at it first off in an external sense, all systems that are, as people like to say nowadays, viable, such as a political system, a political structure, being the easiest one perhaps to use as an example, the larger the system, that means it's healthy and it's growing as opposed to one that's falling apart. But the larger the system, the more its survival depend on moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action. And also, if some of you would like, other than just the description of government, you can take the whole notion of bureaucracy, even in its fully blown, pejoratively taken sense. But you follow. In other words, people always complain that governments / bureaucracies are unwieldy. That if they are ships of state, then by God, they're barges with Gorder problems. That, in other words, the larger the organization, the more unwieldy it becomes, and men are wont to complain. Participants in the system, inhabitants of the area, are very wont to complain that the system moves too slowly, that you cannot get needed action taken in time to serve a fully remedial, or have a fully remedial effect, and etc. But the larger the system, and if you can now consider simultaneously, as you're supposed to be able to do it, no additional charge, that we're talking about a bureaucracy, the bureaucracy of some external state and your own private individual thinking state. That the larger the system, the more does its survival depend on moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action. All right, let's take it the easy way, perhaps first, right quick. A good, flourishing state. And the U.S. of A, circa late 20th century, is probably as good an example as any, that comparably speaking, which is the only way you can speak of a reality that has even numbered dimensions such as this, comparably speaking, let's just assume, even though I know that some of you are actually from that country, don't take it personally, but relatively speaking, let's take the United States as being the, as much as any other, at the forefront of street level civilization and development. Then notice that amongst all areas of the world right now, all politically bound areas, the United States is more complex, is more varied in the peoples, the ideas, the politics, the arts, and everything. And yet the complaint still goes out within that area of the cumbersome nature. To a serious degree go the carpers and critics, to a serious degree. And yet for a large system, the larger it is, the more does its survival, its health, which is equitable to survival, the more its health depends upon, and I could have named put several names on it, but if you take moderation, deliberation, and a kind of unhurried, measured action, it covers it all. But that is the very areas that people complain about. Moderation. The larger a system gets, it is always going to will be increasingly complex, or it cannot grow. If you find, I remind you, I'll go ahead right quick and pick out what sounds like actual hardwired physical examples, but that should be of no particular interest to you. That's not what I'm intending to speak on. But even today, it's always been true, but even today, if you find some area wherein it is a very homogeneous in a political, racial, nationalistic, any kind of sense, it is not going to be thriving compared to one. There are other factors involved, but putting it simplistically, is not going to comparably be evolving and as healthy as one that is more varied. But you have within, let us use the United States again, in an area that is large, it's a large system, and it is viable. It is very complex compared to those that are not as large, those that are not as active, those that are not as viable in their evolution at that particular time. And yet within the United States, let's say, there are complaints, serious complaints, from intelligent inhabitants of the area of too much moderation, because the larger becomes the system, the more complex becomes the system, simultaneously becomes what appears to be more internal assaults on it. To wit, the more complex the society, the more liable is there to be, I'm just going to use simple terms for all this, street crime. That you would find more stranger on stranger crime than you would find in my aforementioned smaller, less active society area that is more homogeneous, that is less complex. That if you find a place that is less complex, either it be from the basis of the indigenous, let's say, homogeneous racial makeup of the people, or if it be imposed through a political system that is a kind of one-man tyranny. As everyone should know, it is much safer to walk down, again to make it a shorthand, it is much safer to walk down the streets at midnight of a fascist state than it is a democratic one. It simply is. But it's not because of politics, that's just an afterthought. That is just dragged into the reality of it afterwards. That's life letting men operate the switches after the trains are already running. And men thinking, boy, aren't we something. But the situation is already such that the simplistic area is safer, because in one sense complexity, increasing complexity represents increasing danger. It does politically, it does physically. We're trying to do it simultaneously with your mental process. I'll do it for you in a minute. But the more complex becomes a society. If you had one little island somewhere where all the people were the same racial, nationalistic, religious, every kind of any description you want, that they were very homogeneous, almost of the same family, it would be stagnant, looked at from any external view, not my view, but by life's view, by man's view in general. It would be looked at as stagnant. If it did start growing, it would be through an increasing complexity. There'd be new racial people, new racial groups come in, there'd be new political ideas. It doesn't matter what. But if it began to expand, it began to evolve just in the civilized sense, in the materialistic sense, the technological sense, everything but the non-metaphysical sense. If it began to evolve, and you came back, say, X number of years later, several decades later, and you had observed it in its earlier simplistic stagnant condition, and you came back 20 years later, and they were suddenly now active and undergoing their own form, let us say, of a kind of industrial, if not technological revolution, you would also simultaneously, if you were looking down on it and could take it all in on one glance, you would realize that it is not the same island anymore. It is not that same group of near family members. They do not look alike, they're not thinking alike. It is now much more complex. The makeup. You would also simultaneously note that it has become increasingly a matter, or there's become an increasing amount of stranger to stranger crime. It's becoming a more dangerous place than it was, physically. Remember, the norm does not find itself to be open to humor, does not find itself open to much criticism, does not find itself at all given to any degree of introspection. Take that with the same time about what I point out, that it becomes politically, physically more dangerous, the more complex becomes the area. Even that being, then back to, let us say, the United States, an area of great complexity, an area that, comparably speaking, is evolving as fast, if not more so, than other areas of the world. At the same time that it's becoming a more dangerous place, there are voices being raised saying that something should be done about the increasing danger. Specifically, it's always a matter of, well, let's create somewhat, let's adopt some of the characteristics of a police state and not call it fascism, call it something else. Yeah. No. Call it renewed democracy or something. But what they're asking for is we're treating crime, we're treating the dangers to the structure of civilization, we're treating it too lightly. We've become too liberal, we've become too jaded, we've become probably too sophisticated for our own good, and therefore we must take a few steps backwards, if you want to call it that, they'll say. But we have got to clamp down on crime. We have got to make this place safer in which to live, or we cannot go any further. It will be our downfall. And sure as hell somebody will, wave a piece of paper, something to do with the Roman Empire. Then everybody's done for. But at any rate, they will say that, and at that level it is based upon observable validity. So what they're doing is attacking, in a way, moderation. Remember I gave 1, 2, 3. 3 specifics that the survival of a large and a complex system depends on, and that is moderation, deliberation, and an unhurried, measured action. So, within a system, intelligent people, I'm not talking about just some sort of so-called conservative nuts saying that we have got to clamp down on crime, it becomes an attack on moderation of a sort, and always with dualistically driven thinking, they do not see it as being an actual attack on moderation, but that is what it amounts to. But for a system to continue to grow, it becomes larger, it becomes more and more complex, and it depends more and more on moderation and deliberation and an unhurried measured action. And so those within the system, as it is growing and evolving and becoming more complex, it simultaneously becomes more dangerous in certain areas, and simultaneously with the increase in danger, if the system's still alive and has any intelligence, it will attempt to defend itself, and voices will be raised calling for protection, as it should. But the protection always would be at least an oblique assault on moderation, on the kinds of freedom, in every sense of the word, that is a part, or you could look at it saying it as assisting, as being necessary for the system to grow. So that will occur. The other one, the second one I mentioned, was deliberation. That really in the sense of, again, let's stay for a second with the physical examples while you're simultaneously running it otherwise. Deliberation. At the same time that the system gets more and more complex, more and more varied, is growing, it not only becomes dangerous, increasingly dangerous in certain ways, and therefore brings about its own internal calls for assaults upon, in certain senses, on moderation. There will also arise attacks on the process of deliberation. That is, within a large system, it is always going to be in some way what would politically be referred to as a republic, a democratically formed or run government. That is, it cannot be a one-man tyranny. That is, it's the death knell as soon as it starts. It is not a living system. That's why tyrannical or any one-man government never produces, not from my viewpoint, from all viewpoints, from all civilized viewpoints, that such a regime will never, or such an area under such a regime, never turns out any art worth remembering 2 minutes after you've seen it, if that long, never turns out turns out nothing in the arts, turns out nothing of lasting impact. They are forgotten, they're simply footnotes of history. They are not alive, they produce nothing. As a matter of fact, it should be obvious, if anything is antithetical to a tyrannical government, is in any form of creativity. And I'm talking about just at the ordinary routine level. Originality is the direct enemy of a monarchy, of any tyrant, of any one-man rule. Can you keep this in mind and forget about politics while I'm doing it for the examples that it's still this, a one-man rule, the norm, a tyrannical government? But, oh, hey, that's just metaphor. Let's talk about real shit, like government and politics. All right, okay. Not only will there be cries for additional safeguards which are going to put some limits on moderation, they will also denounce as a part of that. It'll follow very shortly after that, there'll be internal voices, which are occurring in the United States as a matter of fact, since we use that for an example. If they begin to attack the moderation of the increasingly complex system, wherein lies certain danger, increasing danger, they will also point out that part of the problem, part of the failure on the government, the powers that be, to move in an efficient manner is this endless amount of deliberation. That those dumbasses sitting in Washington are going to debate new gun control, new criminal reform and the federal laws. They'll debate it, and by the time they get through talking about it, half of us will be dead. So there begins, but there has to be deliberation. Again, I point to you, it's the same things. It will appear to be, as the system becomes more and more complex, there will be attributes that are absolutely necessary for its continued health and survival. And I've put the names on them: moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action. They are absolutely necessary. There are things you want to look at from the other view again. In recent history, any history you want to pick out, any example you can think of, look at any form of government, look at any system. I started to say even economic models, but they seem to be tied nowadays in operation inseparably from political systems. But look at any system that has failed, that just did nothing. I mean, they could run banners and have parades and hoop and holler for 10 or 20 years, but even during the 10 or 20 years that it stayed in control in some area, it was flatlined. And everybody knew it. The people in it didn't even like it. Nobody had a good word to say for it. They would turn out the art. Here is great art, literature, music, reflecting the grandeur of our system. And you heard it, and even if you didn't have good taste in music, even if you didn't like literature, even if you thought all art was a sham anyway, you'd think, well, wait a minute, these people have taken the despicable, the meaningless, the moot, and raised it to even new levels of incompetence and impertinence. In other words, it always smelled of death. But notice that as two things looked at from another view, that they never, the two that I've covered thus far, two things, two aspects of a closed, tyrannical, one-man rule, they never display any moderation. There is no room for any sort of rebellion. The grand leader, think mind. But back to politics. Forget all that mind and metaphor crap. I'm sick of hearing that. Let's talk about politics, something that's of interest. And by God, something that's going to impact your everyday life. Thank you. Inside of a one-man rule, there is no room. There is no tolerance for even, just kind of harmless rebellion. Can you picture a good, wired-up tyrant with all the spaghetti on his hat and all the, the stripes and all the sycophants all around him? Can you imagine? And I'm talking about a good one. The man's in control. They do not allow even a little bit of some guy to come up before the general, before the king, and just pretend to drop trowel, or just to go by and just to kind of slightly go. There is no such thing as moderation. There's no such thing as would be tolerated in a less rigid government wherein people would get up before a prime minister or a president and actually perhaps do a direct satire of the man. And whether he likes it or not, which he doesn't, he will go ahead and smile. Because he can't have him killed like he'd like to, but he can't. There is that kind of moderation. There is that kind of room for anomalous behavior. But in a under one-man control, one-man rule, the norm is the norm, damn it. And the norm does not tolerate deviation. Not even a little bit. But withal, in a larger growing system, there is moderation. It can tolerate within itself certain abnormal behavior. It's that kind of moderation. But then in the second sense of deliberation, the kinds of discussions that as the system becomes more complex and it brings about increased dangers of a certain type, inside the system there will be voices raised not only condemning the amount of moderation, the amount of tolerance that we seem to have for aberrant behavior such as street crime, or we try to explain away within a more complex system. If there's crime going on, they will attempt to explain it away, as you can witness. Not that, well, this man's a criminal, lock him up, shoot him, torture him, do something, make him pay. There's increasing the toleration is shown by an increasing amount, propensity to excuse the behavior, or to at least ameliorate it. To say, well, he is not actually a criminal, he is upset, he has been deprived. There are certain other factors enter into this that are beyond his control, and therefore, cut the man a little slack. That is necessary, and simultaneously it will bring about denunciations of same. But then to the second part, deliberation. Using the comparative picture I painted, you do understand a one-man rule. There are no deliberations. Some of them, as a kind of joke, will set up a parliament composed of nothing but their brothers-in-law and people who owe them money. In other words, some of them seem to get enjoyment out of having this big House of Congress wherein they can walk in once or twice a day and everybody stands up and wets their pants when he comes in, and he goes, carry on, keep debating, and they debate whatever he told them to debate. Or perhaps they don't do anything when he's not there. They just sit there and shiver waiting for him to come back in. And when he walks in, somebody suddenly stands up and says, Mr. Speaker, I would like to propose a new bill, honoring our great leader, that we should do it every hour of every day. And they all go, here, here, that kind of thing. There are no deliberations. Now, conversely, in a system that is growing, that is healthy, the complexity depends upon a kind of deliberation. That is, a continuing arguing, a debate. It is not a one-man rule. It is not that ship of state in some way has a course laid out for it, or a course directed, and it goes that way. It is moving, such as all of life is moving. It is going forward, such as all living parts of life in man are moving forward, but it is a kind of staggered. It is a kind of indirect. It seems to be indefinite from an ordinary view if you just look at a system that is large and complex, dependent upon moderation. Then it's also going to be dependent upon, or it will display, to use this as a result of the effect I am describing, it will display an indefinite, an apparently indecisive, an inspecific kind of staggering effect. It is only a one-man operation, speaking politically now again, is only a tyranny, a one-man rule that the king gets up, or the general gets up one day and he says, attack Venezuela, and they go attack. I mean, they all may know, let us say that his army is composed of 1,500 men, and they know, well, this is it. Everybody kisses their ass and mother goodbye, but nobody says anything. They know it's doomed, but at least he can act decisively. There's no discussion. So, back to the other form, back to the comparison. In a system that is large and complex and healthy, it is dependent upon deliberation. And in the political sense, it will appear to be an almost endless yammering, palaver, screeding, debating, arguing in some form. In the United States form, in most cases, well, in all cases throughout the world now politically, it will be some form of the representative chamber, the legislative chambers of their government. But within the system will also become, as is happening now, following right in the wake of the cries for some lessening of the amount of toleration we have of uncivil behavior. That is a kind of lessening of the moderation that is necessary. Following that will become an attack from literate, sophisticated civil voices within the system, then attacking the second part of the deliberation, that they will even point out that the reason we cannot get more done, the reason that the government cannot make it safer for us to live on the streets when we see how unsafe it is, it's becoming worse and worse. And one thing that holds it back is those goddamn congressmen and senators sitting up there and yammer, talk. Why don't somebody take some action? And from certain views, it seems to make perfect sense that, yes, that's true. But it is a direct assault on one of the very attributes necessary for the survival of the system as it continues to grow. Do any of you begin to get a picture of this great healthy machine flying down a highway, and in some strange way it is able to try and stick its foot out and trip itself? Or that seems capable in some way of putting out this kind of unbelievably strange hand and try to choke itself as it runs, try to cut off its breath. I don't know what that just, you would probably do well to ignore that one. Also a part of this, they're not all that separate of course, is the third one that I just referred to as necessary, that the actual survival and health of a system as it continues to grow and enlarge and become more complex is an unhurried measured action. It seems to always be gradual. It seems to always be non-hasty. It always seems to be thought out or deliberately debated until all the possibilities are considered, to all of the potential drawbacks have been laid on the table, to all the pros and cons have been chewed up until everyone's gums and teeth are about worn out, and then the larger, the more complex the state, the system, only then does it seem to move. And so as it seems to take action itself, it has already been active, dependent upon, within the system, moderation, deliberation, that is, many voices apparently being heard to make the decision. Even if it is the Congress and the Senate and they all have to vote and vote and vote and vote, and then the President says, all right, I'll sign it and that's it. That is still not a one-man rule. He does not have that kind of power, because in all systems that are based upon that kind of deliberation that are large and viable and growing, it is always that the voices of deliberation always have the last word if they want it, such as in our case, the United States case, the congressional override of a presidential veto. And so even though it sounds like that they could debate some matter for months and months and finally get together and work out a compromise bill between the two houses and send it to the president and him look at it and go and veto it, that's still not a one-man rule, because they have the wherewithal to override it and still get their way, and he can't veto it the second time. So you have the large system dependent upon, internally now, many voices open to almost endless debate, tolerating, being moderate, which is toleration, of just almost unlimited types of voices, numbers and quality of voices, that the Senate, the streets of the United States, the public areas, but even the Senate and the Congress itself, they can end up with an elected official who is, shall we say, that some of the lights seem to have a short in them in his upstairs, in the upstairs of his house. The lights may be on, but they seem to flicker and spark. He seems to be half nuts. He was either that way when elected, or he stays there long enough to get that way. But as long as it is a viable, active, growing system, in this case politically, even the areas wherein is conducted the necessary deliberations, our houses of Congress, it can tolerate extreme, even just nonsensical voices. That just because there's some person in the Senate, one or more, that every time he gets up and talks, all ordinarily sane people listen to him and think, you know, oh, Senator so-and-so is completely bonkers. You know, somebody should have the grace to, you know, his aide should have the courtesy, the decency to tell him that, which I've always found that funny, that the people dependent upon a king is going to say, Your Highness, don't you think you should resign? Yes. Not as long as they can keep their hands up his knickers and say, well, go over there, go that way. At any rate, it can tolerate not only, it doesn't tolerate just many diverse, complex voices, it can tolerate up to certain extremes, certain limits, but it can tolerate almost extreme nonsensical deliberation, that is voices. And so by that same token, though, the critics of certain growing dangers brought on by complexity within the system can then find a position of a fairly reasonable basis to attack the endless deliberation that slows down, that hinders us being able to take necessary remedial action. But it has to be with a system. The norm within the system is the majority. And now if you go from back to where we tried to last time, after 55 minutes, back to a final 3 or 4 minutes, then if you can leave all that politically and realize that which passes for your own consciousness, that which passes for, which of course is your mapping out of what reality is, that if you realize in the system, let's assume that you are a genetically sound neural system up here, then you are a growing, viable system. We'll give you credit. You should be. But we'll give you credit that you are not yet, your instinct, your hormones has not wearied yet to the point that you have laid down and died mentally. Giving you credit. What the hell? It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't cost me anything. Now consider it is your thinking processes. It is your mental life, not your instinctive bio-survival life. It is your mental life that we're now speaking of in news item referred to as page 26 tonight that says the larger the system, the more does its survival depend upon moderation, deliberation, and unhurried measured action. Now look at it as being your sanity, which is equitable to your normal thought processes. Are they not? Is not your thinking, is not your walking around continual sense of what reality is composed of dependent upon these same things? Is moderation, deliberation, and an unhurried measured action? Yes, I'll answer it for you since we don't have time to take a pop quiz or for you to try and cram for it. The answer is yes. So here's a man, a person attempting, after experiencing this itch, this dissatisfaction, that post-Edenly, when life told Adam, when Adam realized it instinctively, that is, if he stayed in Eden, which he couldn't, but if he had stayed, he realized that here, and we're limited to eating, screwing, and sleeping, which is nothing wrong, but he just realized in Eden, this is what we're stuck with. We're talking about post-verbal man, post-neural structure man. And life finally took notice of what was going on and said, look, enough of that. Get the hell out of here and get to thinking. All right. If you look upon yourself, if you look upon what seems to be you, then after that, we're talking about man's mental life. Because instinctive life, if you are sane by any ordinary definition, by any other sane person's definition, not yours or mine, if you're sane, then you understand, or you have at least tacitly accepted the fact that instinctively you're not going to change. There's nothing can be done. You can eat more, but you can't eat better. You can sleep more, but you can't sleep better. You can engage in sex more, but if you're doing it right, sex is so good, if it could be any better, you shouldn't be able to stand it anyway. So the point is, instinctively, you have progressed as far as man's going to go. You're now dealing with a mental structure. This mental structure, this mental system, now take this story, the larger the system, the more does its survival depend on moderation, deliberation, and unhurried measured action. You are a larger system. The mind is a larger system than the instinct. Instinct has already been set out. It is not changing, nor should it change, but it's not changing. It is not growing. It is only man's mind that has the potential to expand. And so we're giving you credit, generically speaking, that you fit my definition or my description of a larger system. Its survival depends upon moderation, deliberation, and unhurried measured action. And there it is, a man has spent some part of his life, a goodly part of his life, having this untouchable itch, and he finally gets some notion, runs across some sort of activity similar to this, and gets some notion that, hey, that's what some people's been up to. It's not all that weird. People have been doing it. Now, how can I get started? Where do I go? That's a real good question. That's a fine question. It is, first off, if you don't have any realization of what you're dealing with, the question about, well, how do we get going? How do we start? There's no answer. You might as well pick it out of a bubble gum wrapper, because you're not going anywhere. You have to first realize that the very thing that is asking, well, how can we get started? Now I've got an idea of what it is, how do I get going? And you've got no idea where, from the position from which you're beginning, you have specifically, tied to the night, you have no specific awareness that the very thing that you're struggling against, you start thinking, well, you're struggling against stupidity, you're struggling against the inertia of all the dumbasses of the world, or etc. You're struggling with this. It's out there, but that's of no consequence whatsoever. What's in here is the stagnant status quo. It is the norm of your own mental structure. It is the system that is totally dependent upon moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action. And people think, well, I would like to be enlightened probably yesterday, but I'll accept this afternoon. How can I bring myself under control? I'm sick of being like I am. I've been sick of it a long time, but today's the day. I can only be sick of something so long, it's a cutoff line. Well, consider what you're up against. You can deal with it, but consider, let me read, you got one more minute on the tape to reread the full item now. I've just been reading half of it up until now, rereading. And now consider, we're talking about your mental structure. Again, assume that you're a sane, everyday person when you're not around stuff like this, that you're a sane, everyday person. You can cut it with life, you can hack it, you can get by, and you realize it takes no effort. But you are a system, and we're giving you credit that you are not yet dead. You have not given up. You have not yet laid down and died in the neurals coach. The larger the system, the more does its survival depend on moderation, deliberation, which is the internal chatter. It's the discussion you have. It is your continual weighing of the evidence about what is true, what is false. Should I act like this? Should I not? Should I feel guilty about doing this? Or should I try to go? It's that kind of innocent deliberation. It's the moderation that you will allow in your mind things that if you were asked about it, go, oh, no, I can't stand such as that. But, I couldn't help it. It's my childhood. Moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action that a man thinks when he can peel himself at all from the viscid hole of ordinary thinking, he thinks, I want to be enlightened yesterday. But he's dealing with this thing that is based upon moderation, deliberation, and unhurried, measured action. Final part. Put alternatively, the collective, which is where you're thinking from at the ordinary level, the collective is always mushy. Only the individual can be abruptly decisive. It is as though being more alert, being more conscious in this sense is almost like not being under the control of a one-man dictator, but you are now within your own populace and you are your own one-man dictator. The collective is always mushy. It's always mushy out there. That's why things can't seem to get done fast enough. That's why it seems to go in too many different directions. That's why no one seems to know what they're doing. That's why nothing ever seems to come to a satisfactory conclusion, which would be death. But the collective is always mushy, squishy. It's only the individual who can be abruptly decisive. And I've decided that's enough.